Hello, historians. Welcome to On This Day in History, the daily insight into what has happened in the past and how it has influenced the events of the present. On this day, yesterday makes today and changes what happens tomorrow. So, quick look at what happened on this day, the 8th of June. Well, it just so happens in the year 452, Italy was invaded by Attila the Hun. Now, we should put a little asterisk on the word Italy because, of course, this was the Roman Empire at the time. Attila the Hun has got a bit of a bad rap throughout history, somewhat rightfully so and somewhat not. We should point out that his attacks and destruction of property as he went through Western Europe, and in particular as he went into Rome, was actually characteristic of how all attacks and raids were done at the time. It reminds me of the origin of the word barbarian, which Attila the Hun is often referred to. Oh, the barbarian tribes. Barbarian is actually a Greek origin word. And the origin and literal meaning of the word was those that are not us. Meaning, if you are Attila the Hun and you attack and destroy Rome and burn buildings, you're a barbarian. If you're a Roman and you invade the Germanic regions of Europe and burn buildings and kill people, you are just doing your duty. So just keep that in mind. And no, I am not making the argument that Attila the Hun is a good person. I'm simply pointing out the idea of perception. So, on this day in 1953, a huge decision in the US Supreme Court, which is highly relevant for today. The segregated lunch counters in Washington, D.C. are forbidden by the Supreme Court. So you are not allowed to say white people only or black people only in these particular areas. Now, why was that in DC and why is that relevant to today? Well, Washington, DC stands for District of Columbia. So it's not actually a state, meaning it's a federal, the highest levels of government look after Washington, DC, technically speaking, which meant they did not have to take into account the idea of what is known in America as states' rights. So this did not necessarily strike down segregation in the South. It merely said that as a federal highest levels of government, we do not accept segregation. If certain states in America accept segregation, that's their business, but we don't do it on a federal level. So this was a huge signaling event in American history, because this is where a lot of the US southern states that still wanted to have segregation started to see their government as oppositional to their views. In actual fact, this is where you start seeing the rise of Confederate flags in southern states and things of this nature. If you go through the American South in the 1890s, in the early 1900s, and even in the 1920s, you do not see the Confederate flag. You can go to the 1920s, which was a huge time of KKK, the rise of white supremacy. They are not flying Confederate flags. Their resurgence only came, well, there's a whole other history of that, but especially through the 1950s. So when people say that's my heritage, they mean my heritage in the 1950s when racists didn't want to allow black people and white people in the same restaurant. So this is why you have to do your history classes and read a history book. So you don't have to make a fool of yourself. Now, in 1963, this is a huge deal. The American Heart Association is the first national agency to campaign against cigarettes. Now, there were people that were saying cigarettes were bad for your health, including doctors all over the world. But this was the first national institution to say cigarettes were bad. That's in 1963. So that's relatively recent. Now, we all know cigarettes are bad for your health. We all know cigarettes are horrible. But for many, 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 many years, cigarette companies pretended they had no idea what was going on, when in actual fact, their own doctors did. That's a whole big thing as well. Now, 1968, on this day, James Earl Ray, the assassin of Martin Luther King Jr., and I'll get into why that use of the word alleged is in there, was captured. And he was in fact captured at Heathrow Airport in London. 1986, and this is a particular personal one for me. This is the 40th NBA championship, but in particular, The Boston Celtics, my NBA team, defeat the Rockets 4-2. Now, in this game, so this was the 6th game that sealed the series for the Celtics, Larry Bird calls this, who is my favorite player, the best game I ever played. I should have retired right there. It is an absolutely amazing thing to watch. It's the greatest performance of any basketball player I've ever seen in an individual game. So go back onto YouTube if you wish and check it out. Now, I've made my particular bias towards Larry Bird quite evident from the outset. I think he's the greatest of all time. I'm happy to have that debate with anyone. If you think it's someone else, great. That's your opinion. I'm going to go with Larry Bird. Okay. But yeah, if you've got the time, or if you're a basketball fan, check out that game, Game 6, 1986, Larry Bird, greatest game he ever played. And this one is a particularly relevant one, a particularly interesting one for On This Day as well. On this day in 2002, the French Women's Open, Serena Williams won her first French title, but she beat her older sister, Venus Williams, 7-5, 6-3. So two sisters made the final. And at that time, this was sort of a bit of a turning point in the careers of Venus and Serena Williams, because Venus Williams, the older sister, was considered to be the more complete tennis player at that time, was considered to be a superior player to her younger sister, Serena, with the understanding that Serena was still improving because she was a bit younger, obviously. Now, these days, there is, in my mind, no argument. Serena Williams is the greatest female tennis player of all time. And without question, one of the greatest players of all time, period. The things she has achieved in her sport are amazing. She's an athlete to be admired. I think one of her greatest, I mean, she's got many great accomplishments, but one of her greatest accomplishments was, I think it was 2018, she won the Australian Open while 4 months pregnant. So while experiencing things like morning sickness, she still went out and was the best in the world at her sport, which is amazing. I'd love to see a male athlete who is vomiting every single morning go and win the tournament. I don't think that's what's going to happen. Anyway, that's a whole nother thing. The reason I think this one in On This Day, why it's so relevant, Serena and Venus Williams actually grew up in Los Angeles. Now, tennis is traditionally been a quote-unquote white sport, mainly because it requires a lot of money, a lot of funding, private tennis lessons, private tennis courts, things of this nature. So it's been somewhat of an economic barrier for people to play this game. So it's usually a bit of a game for the upper class, and the upper class traditionally has been very, very white. How did Serena and Venus Williams get involved? Well, in 1984, the city of Los Angeles actually hosted the Olympics. And as a result of that, they had to build a lot of facilities. Some of those facilities being tennis courts. After the Olympics leaves, this city of Los Angeles has all these resources, all these courts, all of these stadiums sitting around that don't know what to do with them. And they made the tennis courts publicly open, publicly available. And all of a sudden, these two girls growing up in Los Angeles who may not have had access or the ability to practice and train for tennis previously have the opportunity. And what do you know? The first time they get the opportunity, they literally become the two of the greatest, and certainly Serena Williams, the greatest ever tennis player of all time, which is amazing to me. So thank you to the city of Los Angeles for making those tennis courts publicly open and giving us these great athletes. Now, the deep dive of the day is going to be James Earl Ray. This is he. So he was an American convict. He was arrested in London on this day in history on June 8th in England. And he was charged with the assassination of American civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. Now, there's a couple of things that I need to point out when we go through this. One, I don't particularly like the term African American to refer to someone who is black in America, the same way that I would never need to say that I am a British, Scottish, Irish, Australian. I'm just Australian, okay? It's amazing that you only ever need to have a qualifier in front of your nationality if you are not white. literally in England, the ethnicities on you fill in your form are white British is an ethnicity, which is crazy. Anyway, that's a whole nother thing. Now, on this day, it said alleged assassin of Martin Luther King Jr. I want to point this out. I am in no doubt that this is the assassin, but we will go into how that alleged sort of fits into everything. So, Martin Luther King was actually assassinated on the 4th of April, 1968, by a sniper while standing on the balcony outside of his room at the Motel Lorraine in Memphis, in Tennessee, which coincidentally, on this day in 1861, Tennessee seceded from the United States and became a Confederate state on this day, in June 8th, so just a coincidence. That evening, a 30 caliber hunting rifle was found on the sidewalk beside a rooming house 1 block from the Lorraine Motel. So just down the road, they found this rifle that had fired the shot. So over the next several weeks, the rifle was examined, eyewitness reports were examined, fingerprints on the weapon implicated a single suspect, escaped convict James Earl Ray. So he had actually escaped from prison in 1967 and found his way to Tennessee to kill Martin Luther King Jr. So how does that happen? Well, the FBI found that he'd obtained a Canadian passport under a false identity. And at that time, it was relatively easy to do that. They didn't have as many digital records or double checks, triple checks, security checks that they do these days. You could do it by mail without even turning up in person. Obviously, they've changed that. Now, Scotland Yard investigators arrested Ray at London Heathrow Airport. He was trying to fly to Belgium with the eventual goal of trying to reach a country called Rhodesia, which is nowadays called Zimbabwe. Why on earth was he trying to go there? Of all places, you know, he can go anywhere in the world and he's trying to go to Rhodesia. What made him pick that? That's interesting. Well, it just so happened that it was ruled at the time by an oppressive and internationally condemned white minority government. So think about apartheid South Africa, for example. It was much like that. In fact, the name of the country, Rhodesia, is named after Cecil Rhodes, who was a British colonialist, shall we say, who was also an avid white supremacist. He truly believed the white race was better for whatever reason, because there's actually no evidence to suggest that. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. And he was so wealthy and so powerful that the country was named after him, Cecil Rhodes, Rhodesia. Obviously, that was not the traditional name of the place. And once they overthrew this minority government, it was renamed Zimbabwe. Now, Ray was extradited to the United States, and he stood before a Memphis judge in March 1969, so just about a year later, and pled guilty to the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. So, he was actually sentenced to 99 years in prison. Why did he do it? Or did he do it? Well, this is the whole thing. There's a bit of a conspiracy about this, actually. So, while today Martin Luther King Jr. is seen as a hero, that was not always the case. At the time that he was assassinated, he was seen by many to be a disruptive influence and a danger to peace. Now, whether or not you're aware, Martin Luther King, one of his most famous documents was the letter from a Birmingham jail. So he had been arrested for his civil rights protests and stances many times. Sometimes on purpose, sometimes detained for the mere fact that way he wouldn't be able to get to his protest that day, or whatever the case may be. He was actually under surveillance from the FBI itself. They wiretapped his phones, read his letters, all of these things. He was considered to be, by some, the most dangerous man in America. Why? Because he was asking a lot of questions, he was demanding justice, and he was questioning what was known as the status quo. Okay, so none of that, however, is how Ray saw him. None of that is why Ray did this. Now, when we say why it is alleged, James Earl Ray's fingerprints were on the rifle. James Earl Ray fled the country. James Earl Ray was attempting to get himself to a white supremacist nation where he could be seen as a hero or take his place as a mercenary, whatever it was he wanted to do. He was not exactly a moral and just person when it came to racial equality. He saw Martin Luther King only as a black man, and he had hatred in his heart. Now, even though he declared himself guilty in front of a judge, only when he realized how terrible his punishment would be did he start declaring, no, 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 this is, no, 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 I was made to do it. It was all a conspiracy. I'm just the fall guy, which some people actually have believed. Personally, I do not. But only the fact is they're able to believe it just because of how much government fear and how many enemies Martin Luther King had in high places. It makes the idea that one of these or some of these higher placed, more powerful individuals could recruit someone like James Earl Ray to take the actions that he did. So the fact is, Martin Luther King Jr. was seen so dangerous by some people at the time that it makes the idea that there's a conspiracy around his death plausible. Now, plausible does not mean probable, and it also does not mean it actually took place that way. I believe that Ray's definitive motive in assassinating Martin Luther King Jr. was simple: hatred. He hated him as a black man. He hated him because he was demanding equal rights. Now, this is part of the issue of white supremacy. You can only be supreme, you can only be above others if they are not equal to you. The second that people are granted equal rights, that destroys your narrative that I am better than this person, because you are, in fact, not. So that was the danger. His whole identity, Ray's whole identity, was wrapped around the idea that as a white man, I am superior to a black man. And anyone that would bring equal rights, saying that black men, white men, black women, white women are all equal because we're all just people, that's dangerous to the way he sees the world. His identity is wrapped around the fact that, listen, I may not have succeeded in life, but things could be worse. At least I'm a white man, and white men are awesome, okay? So it's actually his deep-seated insecurities that led him to this action. That's the way I see things. Because in the research of this man, he's actually an outspoken racist. He had spoken about his intent to kill Martin Luther King for a long time. So here we have a person who is a white supremacist, who is a racist, who's spoken about killing the most vocal and prominent leader of the equal rights, civil rights movement in America, and then does it. And only after he is sentenced to 99 years in prison does he then claim that he's innocent and it's all been a setup, and that seems unlikely. He died in prison in 1998. Now, obviously, I think we can all see how these lessons of history are relevant to the world we live in today, and how history can change. Like I said, when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, there were many people who celebrated his death and saw that his death was a good thing, which is, of course, disgusting. And people talk about Martin Luther King and his peaceful protests, and why can't people protest peacefully now? Well, you see what happens to a peaceful protester in Martin Luther King Jr. as well. You can also see that this was 1968. Now, I am old, but even I was not alive in 1968, okay? So this was a very, very long time ago, and people are still trying to fight this same argument that people should be treated equally in justice, in the law, in society. Now, I don't know why that is such a controversial statement. I don't know why anyone would fight you on that. It seems pretty obvious to me, and I don't know why anyone would deny when it seems so obvious that that is not the case in the world that we live in. Why people say, what are you talking about? There is no racism anymore. That seems a little bit naive, or perhaps deliberately dishonest. But that is a whole nother thing. So on this day, we remember James Earl Ray was a racist, and he was captured by Scotland Yard at London Heathrow, and justice was served. 99 years in prison. So thank you very much for watching this video, engaging with this material, and I will see you tomorrow.